I want to welcome you to our Angus PAP Symposium or workshop, if you will. Altitude disease is something that we've been working on in a research mode at the American Angus Association for a number of years, really longer than I've been with the association. And it's something that we know is going to have a big impact in this part of the world and west. Something that obviously is top of mind to our producers, and so appreciate the encouragement of folks in this part of the world for us to dedicate some resources to developing this tool. Real quickly before we get started, I want to do just a few introductions. We do have a number of members of the elected leadership of the American Angus Association. I won't call them all by name, but any of the AAA directors, if you would, Dave, stand up, just to be recognized, directors of the American Angus Association. You know, these folks put a lot of time in away from their family farms and ranches to support our organization. They're good at helping us prioritize things, and they've been a real active voice in terms of moving this project along, so we appreciate the leadership. Also want to recognize folks in the Colorado Angus Association. There's a number of their current leadership and recent past directors as well. Any of the past officers or current officers of the Colorado Angus Association, would you folks stand up and be recognized? Again, those folks from Colorado Angus have been really good in terms of communicating with us, helping us understand this issue, helping us understand how to move this forward and to create some tools that will ultimately be useful to folks in the West. And so we appreciate their partnership and encouragement as we move forward in this genetic evaluation. We'll have three speakers this afternoon. First, Dr. Tim Holt will talk about pulmonary arterial pressure testing and what it means and how it works. Dr. Mark Enns from Colorado State will talk about genetic evaluation of this trait, and then Kelly Vitalik from our team at Angus is going to talk about our plans for an upcoming release of a PAP EPD. So with no further ado, I'll introduce Dr. Tim Holt first, and if there's anybody that needs no introduction at a PAP seminar, it is Dr. Holt, because he is truly the pioneer of this area. I can't think of anybody who's really done more for cattle production in the West than Dr. Holt. So it's a real pleasure to have him here, be part of our program, and look forward to hearing his comments. So thanks, Tim.
Quite a bit out of my element. I did wear my Bronco hat so you would recognize me, so I will keep that. Is this okay if I talk like this? Because I've never talked and held a microphone in my life. Is that okay if I do it like this? And so I'm just going to jabber a little bit. I mean, most of you have seen this, but there's a lot of other people who haven't. And so what I want to do is just give a really quick and brief description of what I'm doing, what we're doing, why we do it, and then we'll kind of go from there. Just to give another quick introduction, this is us right here, and you can just refer to it as us. We have veterinary students, future PAPers. We have clinicians. We have my new resident, which is Shayna, who is actually studying PAP as well. So this is a group of people to introduce yourself to as well. And then, of course, one of the most important things is that you recognize Droopy. He is my pride and joy. And this is Peachy sitting on there. Can you guys see those slides very well? Okay, and I know it's not great, but that's what we're faced with, is that right there. So what I'm going to do is we actually were going to do a demo today, but when we started exploring things and realized that if the slides are hard to see, for me to do a demo here with a screen that's 4 by 6 inches, that's kind of difficult to see. So we just decided to blow that off, and I'm going to try to show you some videos, and for those of you who haven't seen it. But what I want you to do is get into a frame set of mind in that, why in the world do we do this? What are we predicting with the PAP pressure? And why are we chasing EPDs? What are we doing with this data that we've accumulated now? Just a brief history. I did my first PAP pressure in 1979. I know that most of these people were not even there. And I can tell you I'm as excited to do a PAP tomorrow as I was back then. So it's just been I've been very blessed with life with that. But one of the things that's coming up and why I wanted to run through the physiology with you is this is what we're starting to see a trend of. So this is in Alamosa, Colorado at 8,000 foot. This animal came from Oklahoma, sorry. It came from Oklahoma, she's from Oklahoma. And it got to Alamosa, and in about a 2-week period of time, the owner called called me and said, this bull, this steer is not doing well. Can you come look at him? So I told the hierarchy at CSU that I had to go to the bathroom, and I walked into my truck and I drove down to Alamosa to see this animal. And when I got there, they still think I'm in the bathroom today. So when I got there, this is what I found. This animal has severe pulmonary hypertension and he's dying. I actually euthanized him because he had gotten so bad he could not move, and his skin was so stretched from the edema that it was actually beginning to tear. So quality of life issues, I euthanized him, and sure enough, he had high altitude disease. But wouldn't you know, you go right down the street into Nebraska at 3,000 foot, and they look very, very similar. So what we're starting to see a pattern of, or why we want to start tracking the EPD and the PAP, is to get a better handle on, are these two diseases related, or are they not? So we're going to talk briefly about that. So sit back, we have to just do a little bit of physiology really quick and just remind ourselves what we're doing when we're pushing that catheter down. For those of you who haven't seen it, I'll show you exactly what we're doing briefly. So if we look at the physiology, remember when an animal goes to elevation, including all of you, especially if you're from somewhere else, you come up to this elevation and you are hypoxic. That word means there's not enough oxygen in the air to supplement your demands. And so your body has to respond to that. If you fail to respond to that, you will pass out, which is actually quite fun to do. And I can usually walk around here. One of my entertainments here is to walk around and I can usually pick out people that are from low elevation. It's just one of my hobbies, and talk to them about their enlarged jugular, tell them about brisket, and ask them if they're on medication. It's just something I enjoy. So if you look at that, what I want you to think about right off the bat is these animals go to elevation or hypoxia. And the first thing that's going to happen is that, so the lung, the body is under a hypoxic stress, meaning that the body has to respond to the low oxygen. So what it starts to do is it vasoconstricts the vessels in your lungs. So when you breathe, when you're sitting there in those stands right now and you're breathing, your body is going, wow, I need to move oxygen, I need to move blood. Oxygen goes into your lungs and floats to the top. So your body's going, why then should we have blood in the bottom of our lung when all the oxygen's at the top? And so it vasoconstricts to push the oxygen to the top of the lung. Does that make sense? So that's what cattle do. That's what you do. You are sitting there shunting and vasoconstricting right now to keep yourself from passing out. When they do that, they vasoconstrict to push the blood up there. Cattle do that. The problem with cattle is they do it at a very, very rapid rate, and they do it, instead of just going, wah, wah, let's just shunt blood, as all of you, wah, wah. Cattle do it like this, boom, and it sticks. It doesn't move, and it becomes hypertrophy, which I will show you pictures of. This is what we're chasing when we do that. And it goes, and it's just like if you did push-ups, your muscles get big. That's what happens to the vessels in the lungs, is they begin to hypertrophy. Then the right ventricle, because remember the blood flow goes from your jugular vein to the right ventricle to your lungs, picks up oxygen, goes from your lungs to your left ventricle, and then that's the blood that goes to your body. So what we're looking at with the PAP pressure is the right ventricular area, and the pressure that the lungs are creating with the vasoconstriction. And then of course they go right into cardiac death. So when you look at this picture, hopefully this will make sense of what I just told you. When you look at this, this is a long vessel cut so you can actually see it. So here is an animal, right here is the vessel, that's the lumen of the inside of the vessel. This animal had a PAP pressure of 40. So in all, looking at it, that's a pretty good pressure. That is a normal pressure. Look at the lumen size. This one had a PAP of 80. Can you see what happened? Not if you're getting that, so I can tell. This is what is happening with pulmonary arterial pressure. The pressure is rising. The PAP test is going up. 80, that's what you have. If you look at here, here's another way. All the white stuff that you see are vessels in the lungs, right? That's what the vessels look like in a normal animal. If we look over here, this is what they look when you have an 80 PAP. They have shrunk down so much that there's no blood supply left to that area of the lung. So what happens to it? It backs up into the heart. That creates the pulmonary arterial pressure that goes up, and that's what we're checking for when we do a PAP test. The reason I'm telling you all this, I'm going to show you one more thing. So here it is again. This is at 3,200 feet. This is at 7,200 feet, 32 and 72. Same thing with this. The reason I'm telling you that is because the shunting that you will see, this narrowing of the lumen, this thickening of the vessel wall, That is what we're tracking. That's what we're tracking when we do this. When we take a PAP test, and I tell you, when I collect all these sires, and the Angus Association, and Mark is taking the sires, we are looking for trends for them to do that. We're looking for the genetic trend to cause pulmonary hypertension or that vasoconstriction. That's what we're doing when we do that test. We run that down there, we get that pressure, and we make predictions. It's an indicator that that animal may or may not be a carrier of high altitude disease, but regardless, that animal has pulmonary hypertension if he has an elevated pressure, he and or she. Does that make sense? I need another nod from this group. Okay. So when we look here, all the things I wanted to do here is just tell you the clinical signs. And every year I'll see one or two animals that comes here and actually gets high altitude disease because of that hypoxic effect, because of the genetics employed by that, because of the environment changing, because of respiratory disease. All those environmental things that add up to it, that's going to also create decreased lung space and an increase in pulmonary hypertension. So these are all the clinical signs that I normally see with that. If we go to this little guy, why do I chase this still after this many years? Why are we working with it? Here's an example that I dealt with not long ago. This animal up in Laramie, Wyoming, 7,200 feet, out of 435 calves in 1 year, he lost 117 calves due to nothing but high altitude disease. And when I did all that and I collected all these specimens, I tracked it down to 2 siren groups. That's the heritability of this disease. You can look at heritability coefficients and say, yeah, it's 16%, it's 34%, it's 42%. But this man, he doesn't really care what the percent is. He knows he lost 117 calves to nothing more than high altitude disease that belongs to 2 siren groups. Does that make sense? That's why we chase what we do. And here's an important one. Here's this guy right here, he's standing here. He has this big brisket edema. And so when we look at this whole thing, we look at hyper-responders. Remember, that's the term that I use, a hyper-responder, when they get into that hypoxic stress and that vessel begins to shrink down. It gets thick, those are called hyper-responders. So the top of the list, pigs and cows. It used to be, I once had a, oh great, here comes the stories. I promised I wouldn't tell too many, but this is really important because many years ago, like 10, I had a pig in a chamber, and I had that pig at 17,000 feet, and that pig never quit picking around. It would just run around there, squeal, eat its food, it didn't even matter. And it was at 1,700 feet, 17,000 feet elevation, and it never bothered that pig. The trend is changing. So last year, this summer, I started seeing pigs drop over from bovine high altitude disease. I mean, you can call it that if you want, but what's happening to the pig is they're getting pulmonary hypertension. What does the pig and the cow have different? Why is the pig changing? Because now we're breeding show pigs. We're getting pigs to grow twice the size that they were 10 years ago. And so we're starting to do the same thing in pigs in the show circuit that our bovine are doing to us now in some ways. So I'm just going to run you through a quick necropsy here. Nothing great, we won't spend a whole lot of time on that. But just so you know what we've got, this is the brisket edema that you see, that's the swelling that you see there. And so that edema, that fluid comes from the increase in ventricle pressure. So as the pulmonary pressure goes up or the PAP pressure goes up, it gets so high inside of the vessel that it's actually pushing water and fluid out of the vessel wall. So where does it go? It sinks to the bottom, and it counts it sinks to the brisket area, hence the term brisket edema. But the thing I want you to really look at is this little guy right here. Here's the heart, here's the lung tissue, and look at the chest. The chest is full of fluid. So if you're trying to treat these, or the thing that we get into a problem with trying to treat them, especially in acute cases, is that we have them, and we're treating them, and we're giving them medication, and we're giving them Viagra, and I've used drugs that I can't even tell you about, trying to help these little creatures. If we don't get that fluid out of the chest, we're not going to make, the animal's not going to survive. Does that make sense? So what I do is I go in now and I drain that fluid out to give them a second hit. So this is our magic killer right there. The fluid in the heart can't beat, the lungs can't expand, and it makes our situation even worse. I'll skip that one. This is a picture of the pulmonary artery, and this is the picture of the aorta. So why do I show you that? Is because these have reversed. In a normal animal, the pulmonary artery should be smaller than that. And now look at this little guy, it is actually twice the size of that. And why is that? Because the PAP pressure in this animal, this is actually an animal that had a PAP of 80 again. I utilize that animal fluid, and it's twice the size of the aorta. An animal can't survive that way. Does that make sense? So this is why I'm doing all this and telling you all this, just so you keep in mind what we're doing when we pass that catheter down there to try to get that pressure. And again, I'm large. This is one that's just about to go into heart failure. The pulmonary artery is getting big. Here's a normal one compared to one that's about to die. So the reason this is the rule of 10, and the reason I have that up there is because when I see that much edema right there that this cow has in her, then I know that there's 10 times more amount of fluid surrounding her heart. So I can't treat this animal until I get that much fluid off of her chest. So that's why I want to keep in mind for those of you who have been frustrated with treating them, and like this cow, I asked the owner if he wanted to treat her, and he said no. Every time I try to treat them, they continue to die. It's because we're not getting the fluid off the chest. So that's become one of the most important aspects of treating them. So with all that being said, here's what, so one of the things I wanted to go through with you is just to be able to take you through the test and show you kind of what it is. So I'm going to try to do this really quick here. And thank you. And I'm just going to run a couple of tests through it for you. So I'll kind of talk you through this, and hopefully you can see it well enough. So here's the test. We were going to do the demo. This is your demo. So I've cleaned the neck off. This is a sprayer named Sid, and he sprays the neck. This is Lisa, my tech, with her Bronco hat. And she's going to stick a 12-gauge needle into the jugular. See the blood coming out? She's going to go over like this. And here comes the catheter. And I'm going to thread the catheter down that needle into the jugular vein. Bum, 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 bum. This is the transducer that hooks up to that. Animal moving, so I'm just relaxing for a minute, and I'm going to push it down, watching the screen over here that I'll show you next. Womp, 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 into the pulmonary artery, and so I just readjusted it right there, and boom. We're getting the score right there, and we're done. When the animal cooperates, that's how fast it goes. So I'll show you one more on that, I hope. And so we're haltering up again, and we'll just go partially through this one. The biggest thing is, all the things, this looks easy, right? I just go up there and jab them in the neck with a needle and pass a hose down there. There's nothing more to it than that. But you've got to position them, you've got to make sure that they're comfortable, you have to make sure the squeeze chute isn't too tight. Because remember, we're running this down. When I think about this even today, I'm running a piece of hose down their jugular vein, into the right ventricle, into their pulmonary artery, and it's very, very invasive. So we're making a quick adjustment there. And we supported it. Lisa's going to stick it. I'm back here. This is my little setup here. Getting my catheter right there. And Lisa's got the jugular vein right there. Coming up. And we're going to thread it again like that. So we're going to go back and leave you with that. So that's the procedure on that. And at the end of this, we're going to ask questions. So if any of you have questions that you want to go over or anything like that, we can go over that in more detail like that. I have to find mine now. So here's what you saw. So remember, you saw all that. You saw the jugular stick, you saw everything. This is what's happening when I push the catheter down. So if we look, there's the needle. It's a beautiful needle, nice and straight. And as we start to go down, we're in the jugular vein, right atrium, right ventricle. It turns up, it's got to go through two valves, and it's going to land right there in the pulmonary artery. So that's the area that I want the catheter to land. And so we'll just show you that really quick, right there. And so in summary, the catheter is going to go all the way down, and remember, normal, abnormal. That's what I'm looking for right there. Does that make sense? And remember, the key point to take from this is we're doing this to predict how much of this is going on in the animal. This is what I chase right here. If I have a bunch of sires that have scores below 39, 41, where their scores or their anatomy looks like that, The high ones look like that. So I'm training to breed animals that don't do this in high elevation. So I'm going to show you one more video. And now I'm going to show you a video that actually shows where that catheter is at and how I can do that. We'll just show you one. I'll try to point this out as we go. So here's my machine. My numbers are over here. So the red line is going. That's in the jugular pressure. Okay, that's in the jugular vein. Wah, 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 wah. And I watched that for a while. So the jugular pressure on this animal is 15. About -10 to 19 is normal. So this guy's running around pretty normal, like that. 16 now. Keep watching. So that little hit right there. I'm going down, going down, going down, getting closer and closer to the heart. Right there is the right atrium, so I pull back to make sure I know exactly where I'm at. Right atrium of the heart, see it? Right ventricle of the heart, boom, boom, boom. Watch it. Oh, this is like magic. And right there, I'm in the pulmonary artery. That's what I do. Now tell me if that's not climatic, right? Now just keep watching. This should make everybody stay right here. So no one's having a seizure. Look at it, now watch it. See how it's dropping down like that, right down here? I'm now measuring left side of the heart through the left atrium. So this is the way that I'm checking those animals in the feedlot, is I've done what's called a wedge pressure. So that is exactly, right there, we're back in the pulmonary artery. So that's what I watch for on every one of them. See how easy it is? I'm going to leave you right there for a second, and we'll get back to the PowerPoint here. We'll skip all that since the videos that I had. So here's the other one I wanted to show you. Here's a PAP of 46. So you know that those of you who are around this, a 46 is not all that great. Okay, I would put that in a moderate to high concern. And look at the wall. Here's an animal that had a 94. See that little white spot? That's the only area left for the blood to flow. And when that's starting to happen, you're going into heart failure at that point. This is pretty much, once they hit this stage, is non-reversible. So that's what we're trying to genetically get rid of. That's the ones we're trying to make genetic selections of and see what we can do with that. So we're going to change gears a little bit, and hopefully you're formulating questions. Time. So one of the things that to keep in mind as we do this, yes, I chase genetics. Can I tell you if I measure one at 36 and one at 90, if that's genetically induced? No, I can't do that. The only thing I can do is give you a score and say this animal has hypertension or it does not have hypertension. And then we make correlations from that. Yes, I think we're correct in a lot of ways. Also, if I know that I'm using a sire over here that trends to be high, and I get a 50 on him or a 60 on him, I'm going to look at that sire group and say, yes, that sire trends to be high. I'm going to throw the dice and call that a genetic issue. But here are all the other things that can actually cause high altitude disease or pulmonary hypertension. So if I have an animal that gets sick, if I have him get IBR, BRCP, anything, influenza, anything that goes into the lungs and damages the lungs can take away lung space and cause the pressure to be high. So these are the things that I cannot rule out. And then we go into one more area. What about this thing about body condition? What about now we go into Nebraska, and one of my friends that has a feedlot out there, who I do a lot of work with out there, his #1 cause of death right now is cardiac disease. And notice I did not say high altitude disease or brisket disease. I said cardiac disease because yes, they're falling over heart failure. They're falling over and they look exactly like the ones at high altitude. And my speculation is we're going to see a lot of correlation to that. But are there other factors in the feedlot at 3,200 feet that we should be looking at? When I started this many years ago, I was coursed in Durango at Hesper's at the Four Corners Bull Test that ranks right about 8,200 feet there. So when I started studying the brisket disease, the reason I went to Gunnison is because I was at 8,000 feet. I never saw it below 7,000 feet for many years. Even when I would PAP test it, I would go below 7,000 feet or so. The numbers were always very low, and I just didn't see the disease. And about 5 years into it, as the cattle changed and genetics changed, I began to see it at 6,000 feet. Then I began to see it at 5,000 feet. And now we're seeing this syndrome that we don't totally understand yet at 3,000 feet below. So it's concerning about where do we go with the PAP test? How do we do it? What do we look at? Are we going to be able to look at these animals that are now in the feedlot that are dying? So that's what this is all about. So here's my summary of it. If we look at chickens, we know now, because we learned a lot from the chicken industry, is that chickens, they change them genetically to grow to a massive size, right? Massive very, very quick. And virtually they call it this disease ascites. And the chickens were growing so big and so fast they were actually dying of heart failure. They were outgrowing their cardiovascular space. So they got so big, their heart was not big enough to maintain life and they died. So we know that chickens cannot live at 10,000 feet. We know that chickens cannot live at 7,000 feet. We know that chickens cannot live really very well at 5,000 feet. And we're in question where chickens can really live. So I made that up. So truly, if you look at chickens and you go to a chicken feedlot, whatever they're called, I don't know, I'm just going to call them chicken feedlots for today. If you go above 800 feet, those chickens can get themselves in trouble. So we have learned from them what ascites disease is, what chickens with pulmonary hypertension are, and what pulmonary hypertension in a fast-growing body can do to them. If we look at the cattle, we know bulls raised at 10,000 are not doing well. If they're raised at 8,000, 7,000, we know we're in question. And we're even having issues now at 3,000 feet, unknown reason. So this is what we're doing with them as we get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So if we summarize that, the chicken industry gave this to me, gave it to Joe. On the left we have a broiler chicken, on the right we have a layer chicken. So meat, eggs, both of them are 38 days. When you see this, this is another climatic moment for you. Because we can see what we have done genetically to grow this chicken for feed consumption or food consumption, but look what we have done to size. So what we're asking is for that little creature to stay alive with that size of heart. So I've set you up to think about that for a minute, because are we seeing that now? Is that what we're doing? I don't know that answer totally. But here's some of the evidence that's coming out that we're really concerned about. And Dr. Enns and me and a bunch of other people, including Shana and some of this group, we got real interested in this and we started tracking it along with the humans in UC Denver Med School. And I just call them humans because they work on humans. I don't know if they're human or not. I won't go there. But what we're looking at is what we're now looking at is the well-marbled heart. So when and I kind of forgot to point it out on that other heart, but the heart that I took pictures of back in the early 80s, it was a normal shaped heart and it did not have fat around it. We are now seeing, I open up animals and I see animals, and me and Mark do it when they come by the packing plant. We're going into the packing house and we're grading hearts, because this whole thing we wanted to go out and see, is this an expansion of pulmonary hypertension? Is it a high PAP, or what is it? Or is it this overgrowing like the chickens did? Is it fat composition? What is it? So we went out to find that. And as we stand there and we watch these hearts go by in the packing plant, because we wanted to see what the incidence was in the feedlot or in low elevation. So we started looking at that. The USDA people that we're working with asked me what my hypothesis was, and I said 3% at the most. I don't think we'll ever see about 1 to 3% of animals in the packing plant that will have heart disease, and I was quite humbled by that. But one of the things that's happening, as you can see, this is fat around the coronary arteries, which we said never would happen. This is a histopath. Here's the coronary artery completely full of fat. Here's another one. This is the coronary artery, the one that gives us human problems, totally full of fat. So we are developing an animal that is following the human production of fat. What do we do? These animals are eating this high concentrate rice food. We're getting bigger things, and we're actually starting to see cattle are trending and following humans, in that they are now getting coronary disease, they're getting fat, and we're finding out that fat around the heart is detrimental because of all the inflammatory responses it does to them. So that's what we're studying, the process of studying now. So what we decided to do with this, and you might wonder why we're talking about this in a PAP seminar or whatever, because I want you to be able to, at the end of this and during question time, is to put all this together. Are we growing them too big? Are we feeding them too much? Are they at low elevation and they're getting brisket disease? Because remember, when we go back to brisket disease, it's all hypoxic stress, right? It's all hypoxia. I call it elevation of hypoxia. But what happens if they're 3,000 feet and they're obese and they have a heart and lungs full of fat and their coronary arteries are full of fat now, and we're having them die in the feedlot at 3,000 feet? That's what I wanted you to keep in mind as we go through all this. And then, how can we genetically select for that or resistant to that? So what we did is we went into the feedlot because I wanted to see what the incidence of this was and see if everybody was just like beginning to realize it at the same time. So we started grading hearts. And so that's a grade 1, which is a normal heart. Here's a grade 2, which is barely starting to get a little bit wider. This one had a PAP of 44. We PAP'd them every 21 days or so, all the way up to slaughter, up to about 4 weeks. Starting to get a little bit there. Here's a grade 3 heart. See how the right ventricle is starting to swell and get big? And this one PAP'd to 60. So you can see as the PAP pressure is going up, what's happening to the heart. Look at the pulmonary artery. And here's a grade 4, which PAP'd 86. Look at the size of the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery. So what we're seeing is the more cardiac fat, pericardial fat, histopath with more fat in it, the higher the PAP pressure when we're looking at these guys, the more right ventricular swelling they have. And of course we have to have grade 5s. And this is grade 5s. This is the one that most of you as ranchers see because the animal dies. We don't see these in the packing plant because they don't live that long. They're the ones that died getting onto the trailer. Those are the ones that died in the loading zone. These are the ones that die on the pasture. That's a grade 5 heart where it went into biventricular or right ventricular failure and the animal died. So that's kind of what we're doing. And just to kind of show you one graph, this is at 3,000 feet and below. The green is grade 3s. Remember at grade 3 we started seeing cardiac changes. So we're at about 16% here, and here we're clear up to 33%. So this disease is real. It's out there. And the more and more data that we collect, the more and more we're seeing it. So if we put all of today together, we have to realize that we are actually affecting animals in the feedlot as well. Okay? And we don't know exact correlation to that. I don't want to go and everybody panic about that, but it is something we need to chase, and we need to genetically select against that if we possibly can. One feedlot thing I did just to brief you, I gave the animals went in 3753. I left them there 4 weeks to get adapted. I went in and packed them after being there. These are from South Dakota. They're at 810 feet. And now we went to 3753. So when you go from 800 to 37, you still went up in altitude, right? Even though when we think of altitude, we might think of it as 7,000 feet. These guys only went to 3753. And I went in 28% of them had scores of about 46 already. So I took them out of the study and I threw them away. I put them into a different bin and I kept them with the same group. And I went in 3 months later and now these guys are gone and now I'm up to 35%, about 46. So at low elevation, high concentration ration, growing like we want them to grow, growing like we spend our life to do genetically, which is what I'm enforcing. That's what we need to be doing. I'm not saying don't do that. That's what we ran into. Does that make sense? And this is just pictures of what you have to think about. I want to end on this study because this is something to keep in mind as Mark starts to talk. This is a recent study. This is not even a year old, really. So what I went in to do, because one of the things that comes out is where can we go in effectively a PAP test and get a good accurate score, and what about this growing syndrome, what at age? So I was trying to do something that would put everything together. And I think it's important that we kick back for a second and look what happened there. So I went to Montana. I went to 3,200 feet in Montana. And I tested 315 head of cattle because I wanted to get 100 head, 100 that would PAP between 36 and 41. So it took me 315 head to get the 100 that PAP right there. Of good quality of bulls, not shabby bulls, but really good quality of bulls. And so we took that 100 and then we moved them up to 7,200 feet and I left them. Within the first 4 weeks, 25 are out of the study already, and that's from things like, oh wow, this is not performing like we thought. So these guys were under rigorous control, but 12 of them got bovine high altitude disease within 4 weeks of time. 6 of those died, 6 we got rid of. So within that period of time, we lost 25 head, which gave us 75 left to go ahead and leave there for a full 6 weeks. When that 6 weeks came, we start to look, I repacked them at 7,200 feet, and 10 of the 75 had PAPs between 46 and 50. 26 out of the 75 had PAPs greater than 50. So can you see what happened to him? When you went up in elevation, we were not able to select all the hyper-responders at the 3,200 feet, okay? And that's what I wanted to prove to myself as well as him. So that's why people now in the genetic world are going, what can we do to better select our genes, our genetics to do that? What can we better select to increase our odds in making one of these bulls survive at altitude? And I should tell you, I knew those sire groups and I selected them on purpose. So it kind of makes the story not so good, but at the same time I wanted to see what would happen. So, time, am I good? 4 minutes? Okay. So I just wanted to share one more thing with you, and then we're going to stop. So the highest I've ever tested before was Ethiopia. So I'm going to tell this story and I'll make it 4 or 5 times. So sorry, I apologize to the people who hired me, but then again I don't. So, because I have to tell a story, right? So I'm searching the internet one night, as I commonly do. I get up, I can't sleep, I'm thinking about things, so I search the internet, just like everyone in here does. But I search on things like pulmonary hypertension. And I came across this study in Ethiopia that was being done by a group of physicians. Because in Ethiopia, you can go from sea level to 20-some thousand feet in the same country, in the same span. For sure, people are living at 17,000, 18,000 feet. And what they found in those humans is there's no blood changes. That they, like if I go to Tibet and I measure the Sherpa's blood says, yeah, these people live and survive in altitude. In Ethiopia, there's not that change. It's like these people are aliens. They have no change. I don't know why I said that. That they have no blood parameters that change, right? It's really fascinating. So I emailed them that night and said, what you really should do is look at their cows and see what their cows are doing. And believe it or not, I got an email back, and it said, that's intriguing. How would I do that, or how would we do that? So I wrote this paper that just went on and on and on. It's like 4 or 5 pages about this PAP test, and how advanced it was, and how you had to have years of experience to do this, and not anybody could do it, blah, blah. I was actually making myself nauseous. And then at the end, I said, really, any monkey could do it, but I sure would like to come to Ethiopia. And so they actually thought that was a pretty funny thing to say. And they said, we like your personality. Will you come to Ethiopia and help us? And I'm going, yeah. So the next thing I do, I blink, and I'm on a jet, and I'm heading over the water. And it just dawned on me at that time that I don't even know where Ethiopia is. I have no idea. I thought it was in southern Colorado. I have no idea. And it kind of like gave me a hot flash. I started sweating and like I'm going, I don't know what I'm doing. I had to get out the magazine called Horizon or whatever, Hemisphere, and look up on that map in there where Ethiopia was. I don't pretend to know geography. I know where Denver and Lyman is. So I'm thinking, you know, I met these people on the internet. I'm probably like just joined a prostitution ring or something. I have no idea what I'm doing. And after a long ordeal, including 1 plane crash and losing all my luggage and 2 PAP machines, I survived it, lost everything, and finally made it to elevation. And I started testing cattle in Ethiopia with the 1 machine I had remaining. And that's what we're doing here. They didn't have, most of the time we ended up tying things up to posts. Out of 325 head, the lowest I packed was 14,300 up to 17,800. The highest score I got was 34. These animals, they didn't even know what I was talking about. The veterinarians didn't even know what I was talking about. And one of the things I experienced is I thought I was getting brisket because I felt like I was swelling and things. And so this little boy came up and he said, here, chew this in this bag. Chew this and eat this. And I said, what is it? He said, just eat it. It'll help with altitude. So I ate a bag. He said, 1 bag a day. So I ate that bag in like 30 minutes. And then I yelled out, I need another bag. They said, no, 1 bag a day. I said, no, 2 bags a day. So I ate 2 bags, and then I wanted 3 bags a day. And then it just went on and on and on. Long story short, that was cocaine lead. So for 3 solid weeks, I was high on cocaine. And it worked out really, really well. And I didn't sleep, drink. I lost all my, I didn't change clothes for 3 solid weeks. It didn't happen. And so So the moral of that is these people genetically selected against high altitude disease, and that's what we got by genetically selected. Yes, they don't have any SARS coming in, it's a closed term. Thank you guys for having me. I owe you my life, and I appreciate that.
You know, I'm fortunate that I've heard, well, not all the presentation, maybe not that last part, but I've heard Dr. Holt give this presentation 4 or 5 times, and I'm always fascinated at what they've been able to learn through their research. It's just amazing from where this has come and how much we still have to learn, obviously, but certainly the things that we've learned about this particular syndrome and the underlying physiology. As we, as an Angus Association, look at this information, and of course our next question is, okay, how do we take this information and build selection tools for seed stock breeders that sell into high altitude and operate in high altitude? What kind of a tool can be built then in order to identify the sires that are going to have a high probability of progeny success in this environment? And for that, we went to the folks at Colorado State. They're the world experts really in this area. Dr. Mark Enns, who's our next speaker, Dr. Scott Spadell also in the audience as well. You know, the Center for Genetic Evaluation of Livestock at Colorado State has a long storied history going back to Jim Brinks and others, and Mark is the latest, greatest incarnation of that particular program there, but it really was a great partnership there. The data that they've collected, the data that members have submitted to us to put that together in a research project. Mark and his team have done a number of these sort of studies with different data sets from other organizations as well, and so we're very fortunate to be able to partner with really all of the experts in genetic selection for altitude tolerance. So Mark, thanks for being part of our program.
Thanks, Dan. I appreciate it. And I do want to recognize we have some contributors to this, and I'll list their names here in a bit, but Dr. Scott Spadell and Miranda Culbertson have done a lot of the research associated with this, but those of us in the breeding and genetics team have decided the kiss of death for a speaker is to follow Dr. Holt. And so, it's a struggle, but hopefully I'll be able to keep you awake and give you some good information related to PAP and some of the genetic evaluation work we've done in concert with the American Angus Association. So what I want to talk about is some of that research, and then also pull in some of the other studies we've done to give you a picture of genetic evaluation and evaluating animals for high altitude disease. So as Dan alluded to, we're all part of the CSU Center for Genetic Evaluation of Livestock. We've got 4 faculty involved in that, a number of graduate students and postdocs. But one of the things that we do as a service to the industry is to do a lot of the background research associated with developing EPDs and helping develop new traits and provide genetic evaluation, maybe collect data that serves as the foundation for that work. And so that's one of the services we provide, and it provides, it's a win-win situation, not only for the industry, but for us as a program where we're trying to educate students in breeding and genetics and produce the next generation of scientists and professionals to the industry and make them well-trained. So we get a source of income out of that at CSU, and we're able to train graduate students, and then we also are able to give our graduate students a feel for field data that you're collecting, and large, huge, if you will, data sets, and how to manipulate those to get the best genetic evaluation possible. So that's one of the roles we like playing in the industry and like being involved with. We feel we're a very applied breeding and genetics program as opposed to one that's more statistically theoretical, and so we like to leverage our strengths. And so as we go through this, I want to make sure we acknowledge the right groups of people, because a lot of what you see, and I'll allude to it here in a minute, is a cooperative project between the American Angus Association AGI and the CSU Breeding and Genetics team and one of the research herds we have, and we've tried to leverage that information that we've all collected to produce a better tool for the breeders that are out there. And so we have a huge team that's involved in the greater question of pulmonary hypertension. And Dr. Holt alluded to the fact that we work a lot with the med school here in Denver because there's some things that are very similar on the human side, and they think they can use the beef cow as a model to investigate some of the issues associated with pulmonary disease and pulmonary hypertension in humans. And so we've tried to leverage that and garner some of their expertise related to how we approach this from the livestock side. And so I've got a whole host of people listed there. Obviously Dr. Holt's on there because he's a key player in all of this. So whenever we go through and we start to look at developing a genetic evaluation for new traits or traits that breeders have found important and they want to make genetic improvement in, one of the things that we do is we first have to decide if there's sufficient data to evaluate that trait. And once we have that, and collected sufficient data from a pedigreed population, or at least able to calculate what the relationships amongst animals are, the question is, what is the heritability? Because heritability tells us something about how much of a genetic influence do we see in that trait? That is, of the differences we see in animals, how much of that is due to underlying genetics? And once we establish that, then the next question is, well, if we develop a way to make genetic change, or genetic progress in this trait, what will that do to other traits? So we look at genetic correlations as well, and then we'll calculate prototype EPD, and then specific to this project and this cooperative agreement, the question is, how do we use these two pieces of information? If we have a PAP EPD, and we also have an animal's individual phenotypic PAP, the score that Tim gives you on that animal, how do we use those in concert? Because we have a couple challenges associated with pulmonary hypertension, or pulmonary arterial pressure. And then, of course, there's an educational effort, which this is a piece, okay? And that's our usual mode for delivery of a new product. So, Dr. Holt, I'll go through some of this. He's already showed you a lot of the physiology that's associated with it. We call it a number of different things. You might hear it called high mountain disease, brisket disease, high altitude disease, and we're just generally classifying this as pulmonary hypertension. And as we've seen more and more, typically that's been associated with altitudes above 5,000 feet in recent times, but we're seeing similar conditions at lower elevations now, at least in the feedlot. Not so much in the breeding animals, but more in the feedlot. Okay? So our goal in all of this is to improve our ability to select animals so that we can produce a next generation that is better, and we have a reduced susceptibility to high altitude disease. In the perfect world, we'd have a record of animals that develop high altitude disease and animals in the same contemporary group, if you will, that did not develop high altitude disease. We don't have good historical data on that because you go west of here and a lot of our production environments are very extensive, and we may not be able to diagnose after we find a dead animal what it died of. Okay? So Dr. Holt early on developed this tool, pulmonary arterial pressure, as a means to indicate what level of severity or what level of pulmonary hypertension is an animal experiencing. And this is a tool, as he showed, that you can measure relatively quickly, and we can get on a lot of animals. And I don't know, Dr. Holt, what are you at? 367,000 animals? 371,000 animals he's done a PAP in his career. So it's something we can collect a lot of data on. This is a unique scientist, a unique professional in the world. There's nobody else in the world that would even come close to that. Okay, so we've got a wealth of knowledge that we can leverage to give producers the ability to select animals that have a reduced susceptibility to high altitude disease. Okay, and so the first question is it genetic? Okay, we have this piece of information from a PAP standpoint, and if we can give breeders the tools to make genetic progress, how do we use those? So really when we start to think about PAP, there's two questions we think about, okay? If you're a breeder concerned about pulmonary hypertension, you've got to consider your past selection and whether the cow herd might be native to elevation or whether you brought animals in, and we're really considering how do we match, how do we pick the best bulls to use in that environment given the females that I have in the herd, okay? So given that past selection, what I'm doing with a PAP EPD is trying to select the animals that are genetically superior, going to give me progeny that have a lower PAP, okay? And so we want something acceptable, high survival rates in the next generation. But PAP is unique, okay? And Dr. Holt did an excellent job illustrating and outlining a lot of the environmental, the non-genetic factors that can make a PAP high and make that animal unsuitable for elevation. So really, if you're purchasing a bull, you also have to consider what its phenotype is if it's going to go to high elevation, because it still has to survive there. Okay, and I'll go through this again towards the end of the talk, because this is an important piece when you start to consider high altitude or pulmonary hypertension. Okay, and so if you're buying semen, and maybe the bull's never been at elevation, but you got a PAP EPD, that's your best indicator is what will happen to the progeny. But that bull, its own PAP isn't as important because it never has to live at that elevation. Okay? And we can progeny test animals, we'll talk about that later on. So relative to number one, EPD, as you well know, Angus Association has made rapid genetic progress using EPD in a whole host of traits. Just go on the website and look at the genetic trends. Okay? Relative to number two, though, if you're purchasing an animal, not just buying semen, you've got to consider what that animal's individual PAP is to know whether it has a high likelihood of survival at elevation. But it's not as much a concern if it's never going to actually live at high elevation. So there's two things when you start to consider an EPD about how you use those. Okay? So our goal was to develop a PAP EPD that allows breeders to select animals that have a lower chance of pulmonary hypertension and death loss and reduce some of the economic losses associated with that. So we developed in concert with the American Angus Association, we leveraged our resources to really start to perform some of the foundational research associated with pulmonary hypertension. Okay? So from here on out, I'm going to reference a study called the Pauling study. And that is a study where we took data that we have from our Johnny Rouse Beef Improvement Center, which is near Saratoga, Wyoming, 7,400 feet of elevation. We took a whole host of Dr. Holt's data that he contributed to the study based on animals we knew the sire of, and we could leverage some of the information from the Beef Improvement Center. We were at, I think we're over 6,000 PAP observations in this pedigreed herd now. And then we used the data from American Angus Association that they've been collecting over the years and merged those. And so, in essence, what you're going to see in the Pauling study, I pulled in some data from other studies, is a study that's based on just under 15,000 PAP observations, all from pedigreed cattle, all from pedigreed Angus cattle. Okay? And so we joined those three pieces of data, and you can see some of the distribution here when we start to look at this is the number of observations, but here's 50, there's 100, there's 150, and you see this large right tail. And those are the animals that have very high or elevated pulmonary arterial pressures and have a very high likelihood that they're going to die if they stay at high elevation. But that's the distribution, the variability we saw in the merger of those three data sets. Okay? So whenever we look at EPD development, it's the trait heritage. Okay? And there's a whole host of studies, many of which were done early on, including one I did way back in graduate school. And you can see the heritability estimates depending upon which group of data. This is all, with the exception of one, are all Angus seed stock registered pedigreed animals. This last data set here that Miranda Culbertson has worked on is a multi-breed data set with 7 different breeds. But that's the heritability of pulmonary arterial pressure from a group of, or different groups of data. And at different ages, Shi Zhang, who's estimated a weaning and yearling from our Beef Improvement Center, did it at different ages to look at the heritability of pulmonary arterial pressure. But the specific one from the merger of the data, well, we put this in perspective. If you look at some of the reviews and historical estimates of heritability, and for some of the traits we typically select on, our PAP, right in the range of the heritabilities for a lot of the common traits we make genetic improvement in. So that says we should be able to make genetic improvement in pulmonary arterial pressure. And the result that we had from the Pauling study, the merger of those data sets, was about 25% heritable. So enough heritability that says we can actually implement an EPD program that allows producers to select animals that have a lower possibility of dying or producing progeny with a lower PAP score and hopefully a lower susceptibility to brisket disease. Okay? So we've got genetic differences, okay? And there's a wealth of data that shows that. Okay? The question is now, if we were to produce an EPD and we want to leverage as much data, and if you think about this, we use birth weight and weaning weight data to calculate EPD, EPD for both traits because we know they're genetically related. What about PAP? Are there other sources of data that we can leverage to get a more accurate PAP EPD? And what about, if we select on PAP, what happens to some of the other traits? So Rachel, in her master's thesis, looked at this. And so if you look here, we have a whole host of traits that we've typically measure. Birth direct, birth maternal, that's maternal effects on birth weight. Weaning weight direct, maternal, yearling weight, post-weaning gain, back fat, ribeye area, IMF, and rump fat, okay? And so you look at our various studies, and really the highest correlations we saw, these are genetic correlations, with pulmonary arterial pressure were with PAP and birth maternal, and that's a relatively moderate genetic correlation, but it's in a favorable direction, right? If you were selecting for reduced effects on birth weight from the maternal side, it would result in a positive relationship with reduced PAP, is associated with the reduced PAP. And then we have a low, slight relationship with ribeye areas. So large ribeye areas are genetically slightly related to higher PAP levels at the genetic level. And then there's another area where there seems to be a rather small, maybe unfavorable relationship across studies, and that's with weaning weight direct. We've got a whole host of different estimates, but they tend to trend positive. In your data set, in the merged data set, that's a relatively low relationship of 0.16. Okay, so not a whole lot to worry about. Okay, so there's a few potential antagonistic relationships. Some are favorable relationships, like with birth maternal, but there's not a lot to worry about if you start implementing selection on a PAP EPD, that you're going to have a very detrimental effect in a lot of the other performance traits we find valuable. Okay? Now, Dr. Holt went through a lot of these. There's a whole host of non-genetic, systematic influences on PAP, some of which we've looked at, some of which we've investigated, but some of which we try to adjust for in the model. So just like you adjust for weaning weight for differences in age of weaning, we can do the same thing with PAP. And there's some evidence associated with that. And this is from a study Joe Neary did when he was studying at CSU. He's now on faculty at Texas Tech. And he's looked at the effective age on PAP. They did a whole host of serial PAP measures. And there's 3 graphs here, but what I want you to focus on is the mean PAP. We also have a systolic pressure and a diastolic pressure, but this is what we typically talk about with PAP. We see as an animal ages, in general, there's an increase in PAP. Now we adjust for those differences in age, or our recommendation to do that in the model, just like we adjust weaning weight for differences in age. So it's a factor we fit in the model and took out as an environmental effect, okay? The other thing we try to look at is contemporary group, because we want a fair comparison of animals and that are competing head-to-head, so we can weed out some of the other environmental differences. And here I've just outlined what we use for contemporary group in this study, your yearly management code and date, the date the animals were papped, the elevation and ranch. Typically that's confounded. They're same elevation on a particular working facility on a particular ranch. And try to use contemporary group to pull out the environmental noise, if you will, associated with an animal on a particular day, on a particular ranch, and realizing all of those animals should be subject to the same environmental effects. And that's one way we pull those out. We know that if you're papping and it's below 0, PAPs are going to be a tad bit elevated. We know if you're feeding rumensin, PAPs are going to be a tad bit elevated. Okay, but as long as all of the animals are competing head-to-head, we can take that out, factor it out, and actually look at the genetic differences amongst the animals. Okay? I borrowed this from Scott, but really the challenge for us as we start to think about a PAP EPD is realizing that as you move up in elevation, the change in oxygen, the partial pressures of oxygen changes with elevation, and it's not at a linear rate. Okay, so I borrowed this from Dr. Spidell, this slide, but you're here at Denver, Colorado, and the oxygen level we have here, I believe, is about 83% to normal. If you go up, that percentage of oxygen available at sea level goes down. Okay, so what that says, if you think about that, when you're thinking about genetic evaluation, the level of stress that an animal is exposed to is dependent upon elevation. So we need some methodology to account for elevation, okay? And so Rachel, in our study with the American Angus Association, started to look at the effect of elevation on our pulmonary arterial pressure. And really our goal was to identify some threshold by which the information was the most valuable from a PAP, and information that's indicative of susceptibility to pulmonary hypertension, but may not be quite as valuable. Okay? And so we looked at this, and you'll forgive, there's some metric here on the main x-axis, but we've converted that. In our data set, the lowest contemporary group we had was just over 4,000 feet of elevation. So that's the elevation that Dr. Holt PAP'd those animals. And we go all the way up here to well over 9,000 feet of elevation. And so that summarizes a bit about the data set that we used to do this preliminary prototype analysis for a PAP EPD. Okay? And so we know, based on that curve, that the level of stress differs at elevation. And there's a section of that that's relatively linear. We can account for that either through contemporary group or by fitting elevation in our model. But there's some of that where we really don't get to see as much spread in the PAP because the animals aren't as stressed. Okay, but our question was, given the different levels of oxygen stress, if you will, are there ways to utilize some of our moderate elevation data to give us a better PAP EPD, or if you will, a bit more accurate PAP EPD for high elevation adaptability? And so we investigated that, and it's analogous, this process is analogous to you using ultrasound data on breeding animals to predict carcass merit in harvested animals. Same concept, right? What we're really worried about is how those animals do on the rail, what their carcass weight is, what their marbling score is. But ultrasound tells us something about that, right? Well, this is the same case. You want to investigate, is this moderate elevation PAP, can it tell us something about high elevation adaptability? Same concept. Okay? And so we've actually done two studies on that, one with our merged data set, another with a multi-breed data set. And our cutoffs were slightly different, but 250 feet really doesn't make that much of a difference in PAP, so our cutoff on this between high and moderate elevation was 5,500 feet. This one was 5,250 feet in that cutoff. And that's actually the study that Rachel did in our merged data set. Okay? And if you look at both of those, what we see is that there is a genetic relationship, 0.75, 0.8 in general, between elevations, or PAPs taken at moderate elevation and PAPs taken at high elevation, okay? Which is just as strong as an ultrasound IMF related to the marbling score of harvest project, okay? Same level of genetic relationship, maybe a tad bit stronger even. But it says we can leverage some low elevation data. Now what we see with that low elevation, I shouldn't use the term low, I should use moderate elevation data, because our data set only goes down to 4,000 feet. We don't have any data below that, or not enough to actually look at the relationship of it. So 4,000 feet is pretty much the low, our moderate cutoff. Okay? We see at high elevation, we have higher heritability of PAP than at low elevation. Makes sense. You're stressing the animals more, so they're better able at higher elevations to express genetic differences for pulmonary arterial pressure, as opposed to low, where they're not in as much stress. But there's still value in that more moderate elevation PAP when we start to think about an EPD. So it says we can leverage two sources of information to actually give us a better genetic prediction. Okay? And so we found a significant genetic contribution, okay, to both measurements. And when we looked at our PAP EPD at high elevation, we had about a 25-point swing in millimeters of mercury. So depending on the elevation, you know, Dr. Holt might say, really 43 millimeters of mercury and lower is suited to a particular elevation, and above that's not suited. We saw a 25-point spread in our EPD, saying we can make a huge amount of genetic progress by selecting the right sires to use in a particular environment through the use of EPD. We're characterizing some of the genetic differences in the Angus animals. We also found as part of the study that the moderate elevation scores are genetically related and could be used to calculate EPD for high elevation scores. It's not perfect, but it's the same range as our ability to use ultrasound information for carcass to calculate ultrasound EPD, or to calculate carcass EPD. Okay? And so we can leverage some of that moderate elevation PAP. And so we've run this, and Kelly's going to talk about what's going on moving this forward with the American Angus Association in a release. But we've run this as a multi-trait model, and we have calculated EPDs on that big data set and 3 generations of pedigree back on the animals based on information coming from high elevation and moderate elevation, and it allows us to leverage the information from what historically might not have been considered the optimum altitude for testing cattle for pulmonary hypertension. Okay? And so what I want to show is we've used PAP EPD for a number of years at the Beef Improvement Center at 7,400 feet of elevation, and we've used that and we've seen a downward trend in our PAP, meaning we're breeding animals that are more adapted to that elevation. Now, in fairness, that trend isn't as steep as it probably could have been, because we also offer the ability to progeny test sires from a lot of the AI companies in that environment, so they can identify sires that are suited to be used at high elevation. So they know which animals they should stay away from and not market semen for particular animals at high elevation, because you're going to have death loss problems. Okay, and so as part of our service to the industry, we've used a lot of American Angus semen and put those in bulls from our AI company so we could better develop the ability to select sires who will produce progeny that are adapted to high elevation. Okay, so again, as you start thinking about how you might use these, there's some things you've got to consider, because this isn't a trait where you just focus on the EPD, because depending on your scenario, you still have to consider the actual PAP measurement. Okay, and so we know there are environmental influences on what the value is that Dr. Holt gives you, depending on a whole host of things that are not genetic. Okay? But we want to select animals that will allow us to produce progeny who have a higher survival rate at elevation and a lower incidence of pulmonary hypertension. Okay? And so we want to improve the characterization and the ability to reduce our death loss associated with this. So when we're thinking about sires producing a progeny at elevation, okay, the EPD are going to rank animals according to their value as a parent. Okay, not their value relative to how they would survive at elevation. The EPD, we're looking at the next generation. Okay, so our recommendations at this point, working with Dr. Holt, are if you are at elevation, okay, and you are purchasing bulls or females to take to high elevation, you need 2 things, not just a good PAP EPD, but you also need a good PAP score that will help predict the survival of that animal residing at elevation. Okay? So it's a little different. You've got to worry about genetic progress through the EPD, but you've also got to worry about whether that animal, if you're taking it to high elevation, has the ability to survive at that elevation. And right now, our best predictor of that is Dr. Holt's pulmonary arterial pressure score. Okay? And remember, the PAP score, just because they're bad, they've had respiratory disease or some other trauma to the lung, they may have a high PAP score, but you may still be able to leverage some good genetics out of that animal if the EPD says it has good genetics, but you just can't take them to high elevation. So there's really 2 questions. I'm purchasing semen. The bull that produced that semen will never reside at elevation. I can use the PAP EPD to predict how their progeny should do. I'm purchasing bull, who I'm going to then haul to my ranch at high elevation. I got to consider the EPD, looking at the next generation, but I've also got to make sure that animal is actually going to be able to physically survive at that elevation. And that's where the PAP score becomes important. So with that, Kelly, I think we'll take a question at the end.
Let's give Dr. Enns and his team a nice round of applause for their work. So now that the CSU has concluded that work, the polling study, as Mark referenced, that we were very pleased to help support with funding and data. So what's the end game? And so to address that, I've asked Kelly Ritalik, who's a Director of Genetic Services for Angus Genetics Incorporated, to to talk a little bit about our plans to get a PAP EPD in your hands. Kelly's spent the last couple of months, a very high percentage of her time glued to the computer screen, analyzing this data, getting data matched up. And we really appreciate, I should acknowledge too, that many of you in the room actually submitted data to the Angus Association. We greatly appreciate the Angus breeders in the West that have submitted the data to us through Dr. Holt, directly to us in a number of different ways. We know that the expense that you put in to collect that information, we know the time it takes to do that, and so our goal is to make as much good use of that data as we possibly can and give you the best tool we can. So to describe our plans going forward is Kelly Rotella.
Thank you, Dr. Moser. To Dr. Ed's point, I think the only thing worse than going after Dr. Holt is throwing a Wisconsin native up here who has a hard time walking from the yards to the hill, right, to get up here and talk about high mountain disease. But nonetheless, our team, we like to think that we're pretty good at analyzing data in our shop. And so obviously I'm the one up here talking about this today, but we've had great support from the top row there. Obviously Dan and Steve are here with us, but Dr. Duke Liu, who wasn't able to join us, has worked together with me to try to get this analysis off the ground, as long as those individuals in the bottom row, who's our IS team that obviously has a major role anytime we roll out any type of EPD or genetic prediction from our shop. So when we talk about the PAP to a genetic selection tool, and Dr. Enns kind of summarized some of the work that we're doing with them, the association has actually been taking data from you all as members in 2013. You guys brought this situation to the American Angus Association long before I was ever there, and decided that we have a problem, we have an issue, and let's try to make some genetic selection to basically try to move us in the right direction. In 2016, our collaboration with CSU and trying to work together to really give some of that foundational groundwork for an EPD started last summer. Rachel Pauling's thesis was peer-reviewed and published in the Journal of Animal Science. That was that study that Dr. Enns was just talking about, where we actually combined the data set that we had at the American Angus Association with the Rouse Ranch data, along with the data that Dr. Holt had to provide to that study. And then in February of 2019, obviously the first thing that we're going to try to do is roll out a research report on February 1st, which is going to include the data that we have at the American Angus Association, along with some data that you all released from Dr. Holt in our evaluation that you chose to send to us, and then also some data from Colorado State University. And so we're pretty excited. Look for that report to be out, like I said, there in the first part of February. So as we move into this and we start to send data into the association, for those of you who haven't done it in the past, we do have the capabilities to actually input that through a few different portals through your AAA login. Obviously, we have this spreadsheet function, and then you can also submit it through your AHR and performance tab, much like you do with your weaning weights or your yearling weights. So if you have data that you've been sitting on and data that you would like to get us to the association so you can get into these prototypes, into these research runs, basically you guys do have the capabilities to do that, and we're more than happy to help you with that. So when we model this trait, and when we model this trait that we call PAP EPD, the first thing that we got to remember is that what I'm trying to predict with this EPD is the high altitude yearling PAP, okay? And so even though that we may start to use some of these indicators that Dr. Enns talked about with moderate elevation PAP and some advantages there, what we're trying to get at is predict a tool to let us know, what is our high altitude yearling PAP EPD. So because of that, we've modeled this trait, and any of the data that basically was taken between 320 days and 720 days of age on your farm or ranch, basically it's going to be the data that's going to get included in this study. Okay, so that's kind of our yearling age window, a little bit extended beyond your yearling weights and your ultrasound data, so we can capture more of that data. The other thing that we're going to do is we model elevation as a covariate in this analysis, right? So we're going to model that as a continuous trait, obviously, so we can kind of capture some of that variation that we're seeing as we move up to higher elevations. Finally, we have that yearling contemporary group, much like Dr. Enns talked about, to be fit in there as a fixed effect. And then basically, because of the research that came out of that polling paper, we are going to model this in a multi-trait scenario where we're using that moderate elevation PAP to basically use as an indicator in this high altitude disease PAP. And then finally, kind of the last thing that we are going to talk about is this idea of genomics and where does genomics fit into this PAP EPD. When we roll out this first research report, basically it will be ran through a single-step genomic evaluation. Much like any of your other traits that you get EPDs on currently, this is going to run through that same process, so we are going to be able to basically incorporate that information and that data into this research report. So what are our elevation breaks for national cattle evaluation? So our high altitude, we are going to consider high altitude between 5,500 feet and greater. Okay? So that is going to be our elevation break. And then our moderate altitude is basically going to be from 4,000 to less than 5,500 feet. Now, unlike the study that we did in collaboration with CSU, we actually do have lower elevation data in our database from elevations lower than 4,000 feet. We're not going to use that right now, but if you have that data, I would encourage you to continue to collect it and turn it into the association, because at some point we might want to research that. Maybe it's for this trait, maybe it's for a different trait that we're not yet analyzing, but definitely continue to send it in so we have a data bank of information. And then basically to give you a scope of how many records we have, for high altitude PAP, we have about roughly 4,200 records in our database. That was sent in by the association membership. We have about 1,500 moderate elevation PAP records, and you can see the range of scores there. Anything that's below a 30 PAP score, we are not using for national cattle evaluation purposes due to basically the relevancy of those types of scores. And then basically we're using our ranges all the way up, kind of on that right tail, left tail end that Dr. Angus is talking about. Our heritability estimate for our high altitude is right in line with previous studies at about a 32% heritability. And in our moderate elevation data, we actually had a slightly lower heritability estimate than what we saw in that polling thesis with that combined data set of about 16%. And so what that means is basically we're not seeing as strong as an indication with our moderate altitude data, but we're still going to include that as an indicator trait, much like we use ultrasound data to basically predict cartilage traits. And so we had similar correlation estimates in that 0.75 to 0.8 range that we found in our own data set when we analyzed our data just solely by ourselves. Future work, obviously this is a trait that we're not quite done with. The next thing that we want to look at is this weaning PAP data. So I know a lot of our members have been doing weaning PAPs as basically kind of a pre-selection before you send cattle to higher elevations. And so we have about 3,000 of these weaning PAP records. So weaning PAP is anything that was taken between about 120 to 280 days of age. And basically what we want to look at is, can we include weaning PAP measurements as a correlated trait as well, just like we're going to use those moderate elevation PAP measurements for our high altitude PAP selection. And so we have about 3,000 records in total, and about 1,000 of our animals in our database out of the 4,200 high elevation, high altitude PAP measurements actually are on those same animals, okay? So about a third of the weaning PAPs that got sent in actually got tested again as yearlings at high elevations. When we talk about weaning PAP, we're only going to use those weaning PAPs that are actually taken at high elevations. We're not going to use moderate elevation weaning PAPs as basically an indicator of high altitude. So obviously, after that research report, and maybe we should briefly talk about what's going to come to you on February 1st. So on February 1st, what we're hoping to basically release is going to be a research report on AI sires that have a 0.4 accuracy or above. Okay? So this is going to be a research EPD, a prototype, if you will, that basically the first thing we need to know is we need to get feedback from you all. Okay? Is this EPD lining up with what you're seeing in the field? What kind of adjustments do we need to make? Are we way off base on something? And basically we just need to get your feedback because you all are the ones that need to use this tool. Okay? So that's what we're going to release on February 1st. For those of you who have been committing data to the association to do some of this foundational research, you will also receive a research report on your own cattle that have a PAP score in our database. Okay? So much like if any of you were involved in the foot score research or the foot score research EPD, you basically got a list of EPDs on your own cattle who have that individual score. And that's going to be the same process that we're going to run with this PAP EPD measurement as well. Then in November of 2019, we're hoping to actually release this PAP EPD once we get feedback, once we're able to look and see if we can incorporate those weaning PAP measurements and basically release it into a production environment. Okay? How is a research and a production environment different? Well, obviously production is it's going to roll out on a weekly basis, just like birth weight, weaning weight, and margin would for you all every Friday. So what are our next steps? So basically this spring we'll be researching those weaning PAP measurements to see if we can incorporate them into the research EPD. I am going to set the July 2019, July 1st, the cutoff for any of the maybe historical data that you all have sitting there that you would like to get into the association, that you would like to send in through AAA login to be included into our first production run in November. This will get us the time to basically prune that data, right? Make sure that it's consistent with the data edits that we basically have in place, and then get it into that first research run. So if you have data you'd like to send it in, kind of target for that summer date, and then finally the fall of 2019. Hopefully we'll have that production EPD for you all so you can start utilizing that in your breeding facilities. And then finally, I think anytime that we do a EPD release, education is going to be key, and I'm just going to reiterate this point that Dr. Enns talked on at the end of his talk, and this idea that this PAP EPD is not, and we do not expect it to be a replacement for your PAP scores, right? PAP EPDs, just like any EPDs, are trying to identify those animals to basically be parents for the next generation. And so if you're going to take a bull and you're going to take him and he's going to live at high altitudes, we better make sure that he's got a good PAP score, okay? The PAP EPD is not going to be a replacement to find those animals who are basically going to live at high elevation, and we really need to identify those animals who can do both if you're going to take those and they're going to live at high elevation environments. And so the idea with the inclusion of genomics and the inclusion of genomics into your EPD run is the idea that you guys can find AI sires more readily with less risk, that you can bring into your programs so you can start utilizing sires that you may have not utilized in the past. Because those sires are not going to be moving up to a high elevation environment to live, and so even if they're not PAP scored, right, if we can find those genetic links or those genetic ties, much like we do for any other EPD, that could allow you guys to basically have some more options when you're trying to select, right, and find animals to bring into your breeding programs. And so with that, that's kind of our update from AGI, and I would ask our speakers to come up here so we can answer some questions.
Thanks, Kelly. Let's give Kelly a nice hand. So I'm going to ask Dr. Holt to come back, Dr. Enns. I'm also going to ask Dr. Steve Miller, who's you may know as Director of Genetic Research at AGI. And so we're here to answer your questions. So if you have a question, just raise your hand. I'll call on you. We are recording this. If there's someone that you know that you think, gee, it's too bad so-and-so isn't here, it'll take us a little time to kind of get it packaged up, but we will plan to post this online and get this out there so other people that weren't able to be here today. But so you'll ask a question, I'll repeat the question, and then turn it over to our panelists, and we'll get an answer for you. So if someone has a question, I'd like to ask one of the speakers. Right there in the center.
What is the significance of small contemporary groups of breeding bulls that you're testing? Does that have an adverse effect on the, I assume you're doing an index and averaging and et cetera, does small contemporary groups have a big impact on the
So the question was, what is the impact of contemporary group size on the genetic evaluation? How would a small contemporary group impact the evaluation versus a larger size? Who wants to?
Perhaps, especially when the
Steve, you want to?
Yeah, so setting up minimums on contemporary group size for genetic evaluation is always a balance, because people want their records to be used. For the most accurate evaluation, we have really large contemporary groups. In the case of this analysis, we set it at 5, which is more than we do for growth traits and whatnot for Angus. So that's the minimum. Obviously, if it's a bigger group, you're comparing more animals, and that's better. But as far as the second part of your question there, you've got a subset of animals. This is kind of maybe where the weaning PAP could become important. If the animals that you're going to measure have been kind of pre-selected, they didn't PAP well at weaning, so we're not going to PAP them at yearling. That's why we want to get those weaning PAPs and look at that relationship, because we can account for that pre-selection.
Yes, sir.
So the first question is to Mark. You're convinced that a moderate elevation PAP test, that those animals have experienced adequate hypoxic stress for that to be predictor of response at a higher elevation? Yes.
So the question was, I'm convinced that moderate elevation PAP, in the range of the data we have, and we've evaluated, can be used as a predictor of high elevation PAP? And the answer is yes. Now, remember, in the analysis, when you fit it as a multi-trait analysis, and your genetic correlation is less than 1, which this is, that observation does not tell us as much as a high elevation observation. It tells us something, but doesn't carry near the weight that a high elevation PAP would tell us. And honestly, I'm going to be honest, I look at if Dr. Holt is willing to do an elevation and think there's some value in that, because we do some moderate elevation testing. If there's value in that to pay, you want to use that information, right? Because you want to make a good selection decision. So ultimately the answer is yes. It tells us something. It's not as good, but it does tell us something.
So Jeff, see if this makes any sense to you, and then we'll see, because, and I have fought this going, I don't know. My question was the exact same as yours. Here's where I play that, and then you guys can correct me if I'm wrong. I go to low elevations, 4,000 and up, usually not, 4,000 would be extreme, right? Most of the places I'm at is 4,800 or so. And I go into those herds and I test those to collect data, yes. But even at the end of it, at the end of 250 bulls in a day, I'll call out 33% of them, 27%, because those are those hyper responders that I want out of the genetic pool. So if I have a 36 at low elevation, that doesn't tell me a whole lot. I think that's what they're saying. But if I have 109 at 4,500 foot, I want that bull out of the breeding population. So do I think that kind of data is worth it? Yes, because if I go in there and let's just say we stop doing that, and then that producer sells all those 60 some bulls to a high elevation with PAP scores above 100 or 90 or 80, then that's data that I think is worth it, because I have eliminated those from the genetic pool and they've gone down. So that's why I'm using low elevation tests going, yes, I can't tell you what a 36, 39, 41 will do. To me, there's no hypoxic stress there. That animal's not picking it up, and I cannot predict what that animal will do. So when I go, I tell the producer, I can't tell you to sell this animal at 39. I can tell you that I have screened out the high ones for you. Now you're on your own, because you're going to have to tell the people that this is a low elevation test. It doesn't mean what that animal, it does not predict what that animal will do in high elevation. So as Mark was saying, he gets a lower score on his PAP-EPD or emphasis or whatever that word is that Mark used that I can't remember. But I have also taken out the high ones and done something different with them. Does that help, Jeff, or not? That's why I continue to do that, to try to get rid of, in other words, it's a low elevation screening test to get out the bad ones, the hyper responders.
And I want to follow up here, the level of stress, we know the level of stress is not the same, because in both Kelly's and American Angus, throwing you under the bus, And our analysis, we know the heritability of that trait is not as great at moderate elevation as it is at high, but it still has a genetic relationship with the high elevation PAP.
Yeah, I think maybe to kind of summarize, and I know this is one of the kind of the key questions as we think about how we proceed, but when we look at that moderate elevation data and we see, for example, some of the same AI sires, while the values may not be as extreme, the sires tend to rank in a very similar manner. That is, our data would say, as well as the CSU study would say, that in terms of ranking sires, that the moderate elevation data does a really good job, even though the magnitude of the data is not as extreme, the heritability is not as high, but it still tends to put the AI sires in the correct order.
I think that's a really important question. And just something kind of around the mathematics of the two traits and how it contributes to the EPD. So at that moderate elevation, heritability is less, like Dr. Enns pointed out. So every record won't move the EPD as much. But then it gets discounted again because the correlation with high altitude PAP is not 1, it's 0.8. So that means only 64% of the variation in high altitude PAP could be explained by moderate elevation PAP measurements. And so just like what we see with ultrasound and carcass, you can have thousands and thousands of ultrasound records on an animal, on a bull's progeny, but he'll plateau on accuracy. And more ultrasound won't lift him any higher. And he won't go up in accuracy until he starts to get some actual high altitude PAP measurements. So it's kind of, the moderate elevation helps, but there's kind of two governors on there. There's a governor on the heritability, and then there's a governor on that correlation. And they're not set there to really be a governor. It's what's estimated from the data. That's what the data says they should be.
Don. Yeah, I think Don's point was that we're combining the data in one analysis, but we're weighting each type of data for what it brings in terms of information. That it wouldn't make sense to do a separate run for moderate and a separate run for high. There was a time when Angus did a carcass-only evaluation, an ultrasound-only evaluation, and the rate of genetic progress improved dramatically when we weighted ultrasound for what it was and merged it in with the carcass data. That's the same approach that I think any geneticist would say that's the most correct model. It gives you the most accurate evaluation, uses each data point for what it brings to it. Okay, so the questions were, first off, what are the sex differences? PAP test results on a female versus a male, and also about the differences in heritability between weaning PAP versus yearling PAP. So, Kelly?
Sure, so we'll start with your weaning PAP question. So we did estimate some preliminary heritability estimates on our weaning PAP data, and we had a similar heritability to our moderate elevation PAP. So about kind of in that, 1.16 type category, right? So again, a good indicator, but obviously a weaning PAP measurement isn't going to be worth as much, right, to high altitude as what our high altitudes are going to be at yearling time. And then for your second question, as far as separating out the sex kind of adjustments and having birthing bulls and cows, right? The one thing that should help us there is the fact that our contemporary groups separate sex right away. So that should help us kind of confound some of those differences we may see between the different sexes. We personally haven't ran heritability estimates, and I don't think Dr. Enns at the CSU group has ran just a genetic evaluation just for females or just for sires, as far as figuring out is there a difference between heritability between those two traits. at this point in time, as far as, looking at that, would that be something good to look at? When we look at our other traits, we don't see that large of differences. A lot of it probably could be due to the fact that the variation in those contemporary groups is probably more due to the environment, how those animals are kind of conditioned or basically tested, right? If you think about a bull test versus a female, kind of raising them a bit slower, so.
Other questions? Yes?
I have a question. Are you guys taking into consideration the time they're at elevation? Because I see a lot of lower states bringing stuff from Colorado on tap tests and say they're high elevation. Some of them only there for like 4 weeks. Some of these up.
So the question was, what's the minimum amount of time for an animal at a given altitude to get an accurate PAP test result? So I'll let Dr. Holt address that one.
Hi, Danae. And Danae's question is perfect, and I don't have a great answer for that, but yet I'll make something up, kind of. So, and I have looked at everywhere from 1 day at elevation to later on. And remember, you and I, even, and Jeff and Eric, and all the people in elevation that we've done with, some people live there permanently. So that helps, but when you bring them up, we did this study many, many years ago that we saw at 3 weeks of time that there was starting an increase in altitude stress and the PAP score started to go up. So we used to say 3 weeks was our minimum, and we could see that. But the percentages that we were picking up, we once again after 3 weeks were only picking up the hyper-responders that we were talking about with Jeff's question. So then we started pushing it back. So I'm making a long story short here, is that right now, if we can push 4 to 6 weeks at elevation, we're going to get a pretty accurate score. If they came from Wisconsin, I'm going to pick on Wisconsin. If they came from Wisconsin, a lot of them, after a 3 weeks period of time, just like you saw in that study with that herd, in 4 weeks of time, they were starting to die because they were so prone to it. So if we can push 4 to 6 weeks, I feel pretty accurate that we're going to push out. We're going to get a good score.
Angus Association going to ask those questions? You can ask how long they're at elevation. What elevation they were at?
Yeah, so just so you know, Dr. Holt and I, we've been working on guidelines for the Beef Improvement Federation that will outline just this. We've gone through about 2 iterations of these, 6 iterations. Oh, yeah. So we've gone through a number of iterations, and we're pretty close to having those ready to go to the Beef Improvement Federation for their approval. But one of the things we are addressing is the time at elevation. So you can't come to the National Western Stockshow over at 5280, which is, I guess, is moderate in the evaluation, and have to have Dr. Holt running his behind off PAP testing every animal that comes up here and expect it to be a good observation. But you just can't do that. And so we're outlining that at the Beef Improvement Federation guidelines.
Adjusting body elevation to single path at 9,000 feet. Is everything going to be adjusted to the increase in elevation? Or is it just going to be completely hyper?
No, so the question was about is the altitude taken into account of the evaluation beyond the categories versus high versus, first off, so elevation is going to be part of contemporary group. So for example, if you submitted data from 2 ranches and they were at differing altitudes, we wouldn't compare those directly, just like we wouldn't compare 2 weaning contemporary groups of 2 different ranches. So the altitude is going to be a component of contemporary group, and then it's also going to be included in the model. Kelly talked about the covariate, so that there's an adjustment, if you will, in the model as well to account for that. So between the contemporary group and then the covariate for elevation. So animals that are tested at 7, 8, whatever that you're able to do, that is accounted for in the evaluation. Yes, there's some question. Mr. Altenberg.
This is brand new, so have you considered multi-breed? And recently, I mean, there's going to be commercial guys that are going to be using more than 1 breed. And so they're going to, the future looks like there's going to be 4 or 5 more breeds considered.
Yeah, so Willie's question was about, what about the idea of a multi-breed evaluation? Kelly had up on our timeline 2013, and I know the discussions began earlier in that between the association and folks that are raising cattle at altitude to start to capture that data. And it's because of their diligence that we've been able to build this tremendous database of information. And we've had some kind of casual conversations with other organizations. I'm not aware of a sizable database like that that's been collected. And so at this point, we're going to work with the data we have. I'm not saying we're not open to other data sources. We just have to see what they could bring that would ultimately add accuracy to the evaluation.
How big of a role does nutrition play in that actual task? Because that's something that
So the question was about nutrition. How does the plane of nutrition on the cattle impact PAP score, and then also kind of could there be some epigenetic impacts as well?
So, so nutrition, I look into it all the time, right? So it's a difficult question to ask because we've all been there, where we know if we're pushing an animal or we're pushing a bull and we're pushing a 4-H or whatever, we know that growth rate and feed efficiency is probably going to increase PAP, but it probably is increasing it as a secondary aspect as well, because as you increase body size, you increase metabolic demand, which increases oxygen need, and so the animal is even more hypoxic. That's really the problem that we're trying to get into. We just looked at an ionophore study that'll be out in a month. It's being written right now, and we're looking at concentrate diets. And I work with Mark and the CSU group of looking at grass-fed versus concentrate-fed. So a long thing is we're working on nutrition. I can tell you this is that most of the time when I see nutritional PAP scores, that yes, high nutrition will cause an increase, but a lot of times it'll stay in the same category. So you have low risk category, moderate risk category, high risk category, and extreme. Even with nutritional variation up to a certain point that we do not know, then that will affect it. Like the feedlot, I can go to the feedlot and I have extremes in the feedlot due to nutritional base and growth rate, but that's the best I can do for you. So the question is, like, what about macro and micro type of nutritional things? Anything that will affect the body's health, anything that will affect, like, if you are in high elevation and you're not supplementing copper, an immune deficient animal is going to have a higher PAP because their pulmonary system is affected, so they have an inflammatory response. So it doesn't really, yes, it can do it, but it's not significant enough. Because we all strive to have healthy cattle. I'm not exactly sure how to answer that, but yes, there is an effect, but does it play a big role in what we do? Probably not. To a certain degree, I'm going to label us as ranchers that have healthy cattle, and we're supplementing as we need to. Have I done a study where this group over here gives mineral and this group does not, and with the compares? Yeah, we've seen that make a difference, but it probably was one of the environmental factors in health more than it was bringing out genetics. And I'll pass it to you for genetics.
Well, I'm not quite sure I understood the genetic question, but we do know that faster feeding will produce higher PAP levels. And we just completed another study that was designed and funded by a private group to look at the differences between concentrate feeding and grass feeding at elevation. And I can tell you, when you get animals to close to the same weight, you can still have some hypertension problems even in grass-fed animals. And so we still had heart remodeling in a portion of those animals, just like we did in concentrate. And this is really more of a foundational study to help us understand the heart remodeling, because in our team at CSU, there's two of us on the faculty that are more numbers people, and there are two that are very molecular oriented. We want to pull that apart and use that information to develop better genomic tests, if you will, or predictions associated with susceptibility or not susceptibility. But to fully do that, we need to pull out some of those nutritional differences, and that's what that study was originally designed to do.
Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Eric.
So you talked about the PAP, how much information are you going to provide with that in terms of how everything's calculated, how you guys pull insurance on that data, and if you guys have highs and lows, basic PAP, things that all that kind of stuff in terms of making sure we are calculating that and understanding what the parameters are.
Yeah, so Erica's question was about how at the American Angus Association do we process the data, what kind of validations are in place, what kind of description of the evaluation will be available so that breeders that are interested can kind of dig deeper into our work and see what we've done and help understand kind of how it all works.
Sure, I think that's a great question. And yeah, obviously we're going to have those prototype PPDs out, but along with that, there'll be a research report that will explain, how did we model these traits, what data edits did we do, and try to address some of those, common questions that we're going to have for this PAP PPD, so you guys can understand and realize and say, okay, this is the way they modeled it, and yes or no, I'm comfortable with this PAP PPD. And then I think, kind of springboarding off of their discussion with the BIF guidelines, much like we have feed intake guidelines, much like we have, carcass testing guidelines, on our website, having those guidelines up there and saying, hey, this is what is acceptable for a PAP record to come into a national cattle evaluation, and kind of having them laid out. And so if people are bringing cattle from lower elevations and trying to test them at high elevations, that they have guidelines and they have standards that they have to follow in order to have those PAP scores be utilized in national cattle evaluation. And so we are going to take those measures to make sure that we're getting good data, because as we all know, bad data in, bad data out, and so we want to make sure we keep it clean and we keep it concise.
Sorry if I'm cutting you off the question. The other thing I want to point out is we actually, Dr. Holt and the Angus Association hold a biennial. Every 2 years we hold a veterinary training symposium for PAP measurement where we go over some of these things. So part of the validation, I don't want to call it validation, part of the data integrity is having veterinarians that are doing this trained to know when the test is valid, and we have a list of veterinarians that have undergone that training, taken it 1, 2, 3 times. I think we've offered it 3 times now to try to help ensure data integrity at the measure level. Unfortunately, neither Dr. Holt or Dr. Holt might, but I won't live forever. And so after that, we want to make sure we pass on some data integrity checks after that.
Question there in the center.
I want to compliment CSU and the Angus Association for pursuing this. 1978 was the first PAP test. Half of our bulls were high in our Angus. A third of our cows. Today, when we go to select for sires, it's a gamble. You never know. And we try to get help from Tim about which lines to avoid and so on, but that's only out of the foggy estimation. So I think this is great. What I'm concerned about, if you have a tiny data set, it's just not good enough. You've got to get everything you can from Dr. Holt. I worry about you launching it and giving people false ideas. You're going to lead them down the garden path.
Yeah, so the question was about the size of the data, and obviously we would like to have every valid record that we can. And if there are folks out there that have data that they can submit to us, Kelly talked about how we can submit it on the website. If we can help you with that. If you have historical data from years ago, and we can help get that in, please let us know. We want to incorporate every valid record that we can. It's been our experience on other traits, though, when I remember when ultrasound was new. I'm old enough now to kind of remember that. And in those days, there were breeders that were collecting ultrasound data but not necessarily submitting it to the association. Some of them were kind of, well, let's see if they ever do anything with it. And once those ultrasound EPDs became available, then there was, I think, a kind of a flood of data that came in after. We're hoping that, you know, by priming the pump a little bit with this research EPD, that this is the best that we can do with the data we have today, and hopefully that will stimulate a little more data reporting, and that we can build a much bigger data set in a short period of time. So I appreciate those sentiments. Thank you. Question over here. Yeah, so the question was sort of reflecting the concept that because we're only taking data from high altitude and moderate altitude ranches, and that there's been either some intentional selection or even some natural selection in those environments, how does that impact the genetic evaluation? So Steve, maybe you want to address that?
So I think when it's important to remember, when you're comparing EPDs, you're always comparing between two animals. So let's say I've got this animal and he's a plus 10 PAP EPD and this animal's plus 5. So I'm going to expect to know that progeny from that will look at a PAP 5 millimeters higher than the other one. So it doesn't really say that's the average of you know, what's the average of the entire population of Angus. It's all based on the average of the animals that we've actually got in the data set. And so if there's, you know, some of the Angus population is not in the data set, they're not part of the average. But that doesn't make the EPD invalid, because you're just going to compare two animals' EPDs. So if you've got this group of sires you want to select from, they've all got EPDs, and how they compare in terms of the difference in the EPD is valid between those bulls, even though they could be a subset of the bigger population. And although with the use of AI, you know, breeders, they may have been doing some selection of their own herds, but there's quite a sampling of commonly used AI bulls in the PAP data. So that accounts for probably a pretty large portion of registered sires in the population as well. So it probably casts a wider net than maybe what you think when you bring in those AI bulls that get used pretty widely.
Running close to the end of our time, a couple of quick questions. They're right there. Absolutely. So the question was, if you go into login, you're able to easily access your active animals. You've had some animals that are cold. They're not necessarily coming up in your login inventory. How do you go about entering that particular data?
Sure, so basically what we can do is we can work with you to try to get it fed in through the back of the system, because when those animals are non-active or maybe they're canceled out of your inventory, right, you don't have access to them through AAA login or through your AIM system to basically send that data. But we can work with you one-on-one, you know, send me an email, we can work with you one-on-one to gather that data up and then get it fed into the system, because obviously that historical data is going to be valuable for us to build this database. So just get in contact with us and we can surely help with that.
Up there.
Question for Ken. What happens in all these PAPs when you want to get PAP holders in Ethiopia? Okay. what kind of network are we going to build up to try?
Your question was the PAP scores in Ethiopia?
No. So we're elevating these PAP scores, maybe more advanced. The network to get those taken right now in kind of go to die. What happens when he's not available?
Yeah, so he's talking about other veterinarians who are trained to take PAP scores and where is that network at and how you're going to grow it and basically how do they get access to people who can PAP score.
And that's a great question. That's what we're really striving. So even in this room, there's Shana is certified PAP testing, Lanny. So what we're trying to do is expand this. We had, what, 34 or 35 veterinarians that came to the program last year and got PAP certified. And I mean, again, we just kind of made that term up, but what it means is that they came, we studied the disease, we studied the physiology, we go into PAPing, what does it mean? We look at the equipment, we've standardized the equipment now, we're going through all that, everybody understands all that. So we're getting more and more veterinarians out there to do it. I have a whole passel of them right here that are extremely young that will be doing it someday, I'm sure. Elizabeth has done it, so we are building that. We have a lot of people PAP testing now in Montana, a lot in Utah, and so it's beginning to expand out for sure. And it is a concern, right? Because we need to have a standard. I mean, that goes back to Jeff and Eric's question about standardization, and it all starts with the person passing the catheter, right? And I think that's why we're taking such big strides in trying to unify that.
Dave? Yeah. Dave Schaefer is he's another on our team at CSU. He's created a website with, I think, all the latest updated veterinarians that have gone through the training. Come tell me the website.
Brisketdisease.com.
Brisketdisease.com.
It's got a list of all.
Nice and easy.
Well, again, I want to thank everyone for coming. I hope we were able to answer your questions. We look forward to releasing those research EPDs on February 1st, so watch angus.org for that. In the meantime, much of our staff will be around for the duration of the stock show, so please stop by the tent and visit with us. We'd be very interested in your ideas and feedback. Thanks again, and again, let's thank our speakers for their contributions today.